Hi, everyone. I'm Alejandro. I'm an assistant professor at the University of California in Davis. Thanks so much for coming to my talk, even if it's just virtually. I'll be sharing my slides now. And I want to start with the following case. This is the case of Lupita, who goes salsa dancing with her friends at a local restaurant. And the following conversation ensues. The waiter remarks, "I've never seen someone who isn't Latinx dance salsa as well as you." Lupita responds, "Oh, but I am Latina." Waiter says, "Oh, but you're very pale. Latinos are brown." And Lupita answers, "You're wrong. Latinos come in all shades." So who's right about this, and how do we adjudicate in this debate between Lupita and the waiter? Well, it really depends on what being a Latinx is and whether it involves being brown or whether there's no specific requirement regarding a skin tone for being Latino. And so this is why metaphysicians of race can join this debate, since they concern themselves with questions such as what a race is and what kind of a thing is a race. So as a very quick overview of the debate, there's eliminativism, which holds that races don't exist, and so there's no real debate between Lupita and the waiter. There's biological realists who think that races do exist and they're biological entities, so we have to attend to medical or biological facts about Lupita to ascertain whether she's in fact Latina or not, say facts about her genetic makeup. And finally, there's social constructionism, according to which races do exist. It's just that they're non-biological entities. They're instead socially constructed. So to adjudicate the debate between Lupita and the waiter, one must attend to facts about their society, so their culture or other features such as that. And this last view is the near consensus in philosophical accounts about the metaphysics of race. And this is what I'll be focusing on for the talk. So here's the structure for today. First, I'll introduce an orthodoxy, so something that I take to be a very widespread view among social constructionists. I'll raise a serious objection against it, and we'll derive an important takeaway from this objection. And the sort of guiding thread, the main observation we'll start with, is that disagreements about racial membership, about which individuals fall under which races, are more ubiquitous and philosophically pressing than you might think. So disagreements like those of Lupita and the waiter are actually quite common and pressing. So here, I'll just leave it on the slide and not really read it, but here's a working definition of social constructionism. It holds that races are mind-dependent, not mind-independent or biological, and they're not timeless and instead depend on specific societies. And under that umbrella of social constructionism, different views fall. Here's a very significant one. It's social political constructionism. It holds that races are groups of individuals subject to a distinctive kind of oppression, that's race-based oppression. So to being Black in the United States, for example, it's central that one is under an unjust and racist system of, say, police brutality and incarceration. And this is the view that we find in Sally Haslinger's work on the ontology of race. So that's on the one hand. Then on the other hand, there's cultural constructionism, according to which races are groups of people united by a sufficiently robust racial cultural heritage. So not every culture counts, but there's a distinctive kind of culture that counts as racial. And for a social group to be a race, it must be united by that kind of cultural heritage. So to being Latino, for example, in the US, one must be connected to Spanish as a language, perhaps, or to a specific historical event, say the Spanish conquest of the Americas, or some other kind of cultural heritage or event is shared by all Latinos in the US. And that's the view of Chique Jeffers. Now, these are two very influential and prominent varieties of social constructionism. And the crucial point is that representations play a central role in grounding the existence of racial groups in both views. And what do I mean by representations? I mean, lots of things count as representations in my view, things like depictions in the media, assumptions people make, explicit beliefs that people have, as well as implicit biases that they hold. In general, I will just call them stereotypes. They're beliefs or belief-like representations or attitudes that are widespread, public, so known to be widespread, and have social currency. So for better or worse, Latinos like bird watching. It's not a stereotype, not a representation, since it's not public or has social currency, but Latinos like spicy food is. And for simplicity, I'll just be using this generic logical form, his or F. Take that to be very flexible and to be a central part of our social cognition or theorizing about social groups, as Sarah Jane Leslie has argued in detail. And why do I say that? Both kinds of social constructionism rely on representations. Well, let's just focus on the social political account. Similar argument can be made for the cultural account. The social political account depends on the fact that we can differentiate race-based oppression from other kinds of oppression. And what makes race-based oppression distinctive is that it's accompanied by representations or stereotype about the target group that is oppressed. So Hesslinger calls these perceptions or imaginations about the racial group, but it really just boils down to the same thing, which is stereotypes that people have about these groups. And in particular, she focuses on stereotypes about phenotype or about ancestral origin, but in general, the crucial point just is that stereotypes play a central role in the existence of racial groups. The same thing can be said about Jeffers. He has to distinguish cultural groups which are racial from those which are not racial, and the way he does it is by appealing to beliefs that people have in the society. So this is the orthodoxy in social constructionism I want to criticize. It's the view that representations play an essential role in the social construction of race. In the longer version of the paper, I talk about whether the role is constitutive or causal, and both of them count in the view. Both of them are attacked by the argument. And one can sort of spell out the orthodoxy as three distinct claims. First one is representational control, is the fact that the existence of races depends on representations, so that's what grounds them. The second is nature as content, is that the content of the stereotype spells out the nature of the racial group. So if you want to learn what the racial group is, one has to attend to the relevant stereotypes in the society. And then the third is more optional. It's more of a simplification. It's holding that those representations can be stated as beliefs or belief-like attitudes about the racial group, and they can be expressed as generics. And someone who's very good at articulating this very explicitly is Ron Allen in his book, The Construction of Humankind. So what someone who holds the orthodoxy will say is that to resolve the disagreement between Lupita and the waiter, one has to console their society's stereotypes about Latinos. It'll be something like this, some kind of, Latinos have some kind of relation to Spanish, or some kind of relation to the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Latinos look like this, or they have some kind of relation of behavioral resemblance to Sofia Vergara's character in the famous sitcom Modern Family. Something along those lines is what specifies what Latinos are. And it's by comparing Lupita with that we ascertain whether she is Latina or not. So we'll call this orthodoxy, held by Hesslinger and Jeffers and many others in the social constructionist camp, call it representational constructionism. So what's my problem with the view? It can be stated quite succinctly is whose stereotypes count in the social constructionism of race, of a racial group, and is there guaranteed to always be a consistent set of society-wide stereotypes about a racial group? Or can the situation arise instead that within a society, there's one significant and numerous group of people holding the stereotype, but an equally significant and numerous group of individuals who either don't hold the stereotype or explicitly reject it or deny it? What happens in that kind of case? And the fact is that there's much reason to think that this stereotype does arise, and that kind of situation is studied often in the social sciences. Three specific kind of phenomena come to mind as really significant examples. The first one is the case of inverse colorism. So colorism is the phenomenon wherein individuals with darker skin tone are subject to significant social disadvantages and costs, say lower average wages. But on the flip side of that, individuals with lighter skin tone have also a distinctive, although non-comparable, and it's not relevant to compare it, but they also suffered significant costs or disadvantages, and that is that they are thought to be weakly racially identified. So individuals with lighter skin tone are thought to be less Latino or less Black. And that's what's called inverse colorism, studied by the anthropologist Margaret Hunter in great detail. So that's one phenomenon. Then a similar one is class-based discrimination, is the phenomenon wherein individuals who are known to engage in behaviors associated with the middle class or with being white are also thought to be weakly racially identified. And an important example of this is being fluent in Black English vernacular within Black people. That's thought to, if you're no longer fluent or decide to engage in code switching and don't regularly engage in Black English vernacular, that's thought to be a mark that you're no longer Black or you're less Black than you were before. And those are two seminal studies on the subject. And then there's a phenomenon of hyperdescent, wherein individuals with mixed ancestry, so with white and non-white ancestors, are more likely to be categorized as non-white, to be pushed away from the category of white, even in cases where the ancestry is equally mixed. So a person has equal claim to being one or the other, at least based on their ancestry. And this phenomenon has different kinds of manifestations, and they're studied in different social sciences. Within psychology is the phenomenon is studied in facial perception. So individuals who are phenotypically ambiguous could be Asian or could be white, as in this case, are more readily classified as being Asian, even if they really fall kind of in the intermediate of the spectrum, and they could go either way, so to speak. That's in psychology. In sociology, it's also the fact that as a long-standing and stable matter of fact, it's harder for people with mixed ancestry to claim to being white than being non-white. And the crucial fact is that in all these kind of phenomena, situations arise in which individuals disagree about racial membership. So someone might think that they're still Latino, even though they have a lighter skin tone. Nonetheless, there'll be a significant number of people in the community who will disagree and try to classify someone as not Latino anymore. And an important point I want to make about all these cases is that the disagreements that arise are substantive. What I mean by that is that parties are relatively reasonable. There's no one who's obviously ignorant or who's obviously just substantively wrong. No one who's speaking incoherently as far as anyone can tell, or anyone who's acting in bad faith. And in fact, parties just take themselves to be articulating what they sincerely believe about the racial group. So the waiter sincerely believes that Latinos have dark skin or brown, whereas Lupita sincerely believes that they come in all shades. And the second thing that's interesting and important about these cases is that racial membership is taken to be a valuable social good, the kind of thing that's worth fighting over and determining precisely who falls under the group or not, because doing so bestows upon the person significant social value. So it's Lupita's perspective that it is wrong for Latinos to have their race denied, whereas it is the waiter's perspective that it is wrong for non-Latinos to claim that they're members. This is part of why it's worth to focus on these kinds of cases. People think that it's important to get these cases right. And it's also the kind of thing that has not been sufficiently studied in the field, the fact that there can be so much disagreement. Okay, so on the basis of these observations from the social sciences, we can form an objection against the orthodoxy, against representational constructionism. And this is based on the fact that there's evidence of systematic discrepancies in people's beliefs about racial groups between different races. So lots of beliefs vary depending on one's race. The formation of beliefs matters depending on one's race. But here I'll be studying mostly two, and then I'll allude to a third one that we can discuss in Q&A. The first one is beliefs about phenotype or perceptual appearance or facial appearance. And this is a famous case of same race or other race phenomena in facial perception, wherein individuals of the same race have their faces perceived holistically. So we perceive their faces based on a lot of the features of their faces, whereas individuals of another race are instead perceived featurally. So we instead fixate on specific features of their face instead of attending to all the features or a number of the features of their race, of their face. Sorry. Here's an important study of that effect. And so, assuming that the fact that people perceive each other's faces like this, depending on one's own race, assuming that that fact influences how we form beliefs about facial appearances, we can't easily say that Latinos look like X. We should instead say that Latinos look like X to other Latinos, whereas they look like Y to non-Latinos. So really, there is a different kind of appearance to different racial groups. So that's one important case. There's the other important case of stereotypes about distinctive or sort of common behaviors. And there's also variation among races in that particular case. So a lot of that can be found in the so-called stereotype accuracy literature in social psychology. And two different kinds of variations have been studied closely by social psychologists. There's on the one hand what's called a typicality, which is the percentage of stereotypical individuals or percentage of individuals satisfying that feature. And then there's, on the other hand, there's dispersion, which is how widely individuals vary from the norm. So people might agree on what the norm is, but still disagree on how variegated the group is and how far you can stray from the norm or how closely people stay within the norm. These are two studies about typicality and dispersion. And the findings generally are that people overestimate the typicality of other race individuals. So for example, white people tend to overestimate the number of households or Black households wherein there is an absent father. So based on one's declaration of how often that is, it's approximated that it's 1 in 4 households that there's an absent father, whereas white people tend to overestimate that close to a third or a half in other studies. Half of all Black households have absent parents or fathers specifically. So that's typicality, and it also turns out that individuals underestimate dispersion for non-white races in particular, but that's more generally about other races. So white people might tend to think that Black people are much more monolithic and much more follow much closer what the norm is than they in fact do, and Black people tend to be much more, much less monolithical than is estimated by other races. So on the basis of these observations within social psychology, we can conclude that the following stereotypes are not a good basis on which to ground races: stereotypes about phenotypical appearances and stereotypes about characteristic or common behaviors. So instead, we have the case that a society is split between members of the race and non-members of the race, and both of them tend to disagree and tend to form different stereotypes that are incompatible with each other. And an important case that also needs to be addressed is stereotypes about ancestral origins. That's something that a lot of people decide to focus on the social formation of race. And I included it on the slides, but this is left for discussion, say in the Q&A. So on the basis of that, we can put everything together in what I call the aggregation objection against representational constructionism. This is the following two claims. The first is that there's no guarantee that there are society-wide stereotypes about a racial group which could provide the ground for the racial group's existence, since people tend to disagree. And in fact, there's much reason to doubt that such stereotypes do exist for important features. We've discussed two, and I've left one for the slides. as phenotypical appearances, characteristic behaviors, and ancestral origins. People do, in fact, tend to disagree about those. And an important point that I want to make here is that it matters that these are not just any groups of people. It matters that this is not just an arbitrary division of everyone in society between, say, people who are taller than the norm and shorter than the norm. That would be an arbitrary distinction that makes no difference to racial reality. Instead, it's groups that you would expect have a specific say and weight in the construction of social reality. It's Latinos on one hand and non-Latinos. Presumably, they're crucial to the formation of what being Latino is in that society. And so that's a crucial factor of the aggregation objection that in the longer version of the paper, I go into much detail. But it does matter that there are different kinds of racial groups which you would expect play a part in the formation of reality. And to sort of illustrate what the objection is, suppose that a philosophy professor divides the class into two factions, say about whether there's free will or not, and substantive spirited disagreement emerges, just like half and half of the class, one arguing that it does exist, free will does exist, half arguing that it doesn't, and no one seems to budge at the end of the class. Whereas the professor reports the opinions of only one faction. He reports it as everyone in the class thought that there's no free will. One would argue that this is an incomplete or inaccurate theory of the students' beliefs, given that there was a significant and numerous faction of the class which disagreed. And the aggregation objection is basically stating that if representational constructionism were true, the whole of racial reality would be like that, where large, significant swaths of society would be irrelevant to the social reality of race. And instead you'd have that there's one milieu or one faction of society which plays a role in grounding the existence of race, whereas the rest of society would not, in fact, play a grounding role in the existence of that racial group. And this, I think, would constitute a distinctive, novel kind of ontological injustice. So this is not epistemic injustice, no one's testimonies are not being taken seriously, but it's instead a distinctively ontological kind of injustice where large swaths of society play no role in the grounding or social formation of race. And I deny that that's in fact the case. I think instead, lots of racial groups form part of the grounding base of the racial group. So it's not just one, it's everyone in society, or at least every significant group and every race that plays a part in the formation of that racial group. So that was the objection against the orthodoxy. And I want to very briefly conclude by discussing an important takeaway of our discussion. And that is that there's a vast number of individuals whose membership in the race is precarious. That is, embraced by some in some context, but doubted by others and in other contexts. So the individual is left in this sort of precarious situation where some of them will agree with them on their own assessment of their race, whereas others will disagree with them. And I think in the typical case, persistent doubt of other people about one's racial membership can lead to internal conflict, confusion, or outright identity crisis about who in fact, whether one is in fact a member of the race or not. One can lead to this like dual consciousness situation, Du Boisian double consciousness, wherein one is actually, or considers oneself black, but one is perceived as being white, and so forth. And a crucial fact about this is that people whose membership is precarious, they're at the margins of racial groups. They're not taken to be paradigmatic or typical members of the racial groups. And if there's something that I want to leave you all with, is with the important takeaway that representational accounts of race neglect these individuals at the margins. They just focus on perceptions that people have about the typical or obvious case. And it's very worthwhile to try to account for their racial membership and to build an account of race that can make sense of their experiences and not just the typical or obvious experience. Thank you, and really looking forward to Q&A.